This is Creepy, a podcast dedicated to sharing the most famous, chilling, and disturbing creepypastas and urban legends in the world. Whether these stories truly happened or are simply fabrications is for you to decide. These stories may contain graphic depictions of violence and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Creepy presents The Desolation at Sentinel Peak Firewatch Will Haunt Me Forever. Written by Kyle Harrison. Our plane cropped over the horizon, the endless woods meandering and covering every inch of land for miles around the forested area, effectively isolating it from the rest of the earth by mountains on almost all sides. Within the bowl-shaped valley of greenery, it was easy to spot where we were headed. The blackened tower stood out like an altar of ash amid the lush firs. As we got closer, a memory flashed in my head about the conversation I'd had with the chief forest officer, Vince Wesley, only the day before in Ontario. The incident happened over the winter break. A couple of blokes from Cali came in to do the watchman duty for some extra bucks. Probably needed the cash for the holidays, and heaven's sakes, you know we've been so short-handed lately, Nate, it's not like I had a choice. I figured they'd basically be holed up in the tower for a couple of weeks with nothing to do but whack off and smoke weed or whatever. They seemed harmless, he told me. So then what happened? I remember asking. Paul said it was arson. He thought it was an accident. I guess that's why they called me in, huh? The expert. I didn't bother telling him it had been almost 4 years since I've been involved in any official investigation like this. Truth be told, I was a little like those kids, eager for cash and down on my luck. Since it seemed like an open and shut case, I thought I'd be here for a day at the most. Slowly, we declined toward the south part of the lakeshore, the plane gliding gracefully across the top of the morning fog as I got a better look at the Firewatch station. It surprised me to see how much of it was still standing. From this angle, at least half the building looked like it was untouched, perhaps more. Built of steel and stone and a mix of cement and wood, it should have collapsed if the fire was as intense as Vince claimed it to be, especially if it served from within. As the seaplane came to a stop, I stopped an officer coming to meet me. His smile was warm and friendly, but a few bruises and a cast on his knee told me the older man hadn't had a very pleasant Christmas. "You must be the inspector, Nathan, right?" he said as he leaned on his good leg. "Just call me Nate. Sorry it took a little longer than expected to get here. Hard to find a pilot that wants to fly this time of year, I guess," I told him as I gathered my things. I hadn't packed much, again expecting this to be a short trip since the station itself was not much larger than the average 2-bedroom cabin. Not even a change of clothes. He told me that the place seemed to have a bad mojo about it, and he hoped my stay wouldn't be long. We stood there for an awkward moment while he peered up towards a stairwell that led to the main lookout, maybe speculating what had happened. Then he clasped his hands together and helped me with my backpack. "Well, the tower isn't going anywhere. Let me show you where you'll be staying," he said. The seaplane captain waved us off, and then we were alone. As I watched its reflection disappear from the surface of the water, I realized just how alone out here we were. The valley seemed endless. The sky was so quiet, and the tower suddenly seemed a bit more imposing as I stood there at its feet. "Have you been up there since it happened?" I asked. Immediately he got skittish and told me that he didn't want to mess up the scene of the crime. Something about his reply left me wondering if he might be hiding something. I nodded absent-mindedly, wondering why I'd even considered he might have any information to give me. So I pulled my pack a little closer to me and followed him down a winding trail towards what looked like a small recreational vehicle. He said it was the best they could do given the circumstances. I wasn't complaining. I could tell that Sentinel Peak was a pretty lonely place besides a lookout. Not much besides trees to look at, I thought. There were 2 small beds, a few cabinets, mini kitchen and toilet, and maybe enough food for a few days. I don't really think that I'm going to be here that long, I told him as he offered me a cup of coffee. Paul told me that this was a lot better than outside. Bears in these parts get hungry this time of year since there's not much else in the area to eat. They get a little desperate, he commented. We both pulled up a chair, and I got the feeling that if I was going to get this investigation done, it would require that I cooperated with him. So, the bodies, will that attract bears too? I asked. There weren't any bodies, he told me, and he guessed that whoever did it would be hightailing out of here after the deed was done. I thought they died in the incident, I said, recalling what Vincent told me. He said that if they did die, then the fire ate them up. Then he changed it to say that maybe they went missing altogether. Honestly, his flip-flopping was mighty suspicious if you ask me. Something about what he was telling me didn't add up, so I decided to change the subject. You mentioned earlier not many people come here, right? So what's the lookout tower for? According to him, there was a lumber company a few miles east of here in the valley. Or at least there was one until a few years back. COVID didn't pass him by and the company fell into bankruptcy. So it's just sitting out there untouched? They leave all their equipment behind? That's what seemed to happen around here. People come and try to make this area theirs, and Mother Nature fights back, pushes us back. He said he's often felt that they weren't welcome here, that there's a force that doesn't want us here. It was the first extremely serious thing he'd said since I arrived. I sat there for an awkward moment as he stared at me stone-faced and then laughed, almost uncontrollably. He didn't seem to be happy to be here either. I sighed and looked down at the coffee, realizing I didn't really feel comfortable being here longer than necessary. I stood up and stretched and told him I'd go up to the lookout and see what I could find out. He kept insisting that I wait, but I didn't want to. I needed answers, and the weirdo wasn't giving them. The air around me felt still, and I walked up the trail toward the tower, my imagination playing out what I might find. As I took a first step onto the wooden stairwell, the entire lookout made a creaking noise, and I froze for a moment, wondering how secure the place was. It didn't look too unstable, but it didn't make me feel safe when every step I made caused more noise to resound through the valley. As I climbed above the tree line, I felt like I was going into the clouds, getting a chance to see the forest from a different view. Here at this level, it was an ocean of firs and pines, easy to get lost in, or drown in the endless green. The signs of the fire became evident when I made the next round of steps, some of them bent and warped by the flames. Then it got worse the next level, turning completely to black ash as I reached the top. The door was barely on its hinges, a gentle breeze inviting me to go in and see what had occurred. I took out my smartphone to get a good bit of light as I saw the sun was beginning to set over the forest and went in. The smell of ash mixed with burnt flesh as my tiny light illuminated the destruction. There really wasn't a part of the small building that hadn't been completely burnt up by the fire. Books and furniture were blackened or completely disintegrated. The metal chairs were melted and twisted. The computer was broken and leaning towards the center of the room. It seemed clear that the fire had started there, near where a small coffee table had once sat. In its place now was a deep scar that seemed to infect the very ground. A dark black spot that spread out its tentacles in all directions. Yet then, as I turned toward the other side of the Firewatch, I realized that most of it was untouched, as though the flames had mysteriously stopped when reaching a certain intensity. The couch was sitting there, looking toward the inferno as though entertained by the immolation. And beyond it, the kitchen looked perfectly intact. Why hadn't the volunteers simply used this as their exit strategy? I wondered as I stepped toward the tiny restroom and saw where one of them had spent their final few moments. The corpse was darker than the starry sky that was meshing with the old building. His body collapsed and hugging the toilet as though he'd been vomiting. Yet the appearance of his body, frozen now by the after effects of the inferno, did not indicate that this man was hiding here and hoping to remain safe from the blaze. Instead, it told me that whatever had happened was swift. So unexpected that they hadn't even had time to protect their bodies, they'd hurled into the porta-john one last time. How was that possible? I've studied quick brush fires for most of my life in this job, and I'd never seen one burn so powerfully and so quickly. And the second corpse was nowhere in sight. Had the second man escaped and just decided to bolt? The fire was to be considered intentional, according to the brief report that Paul had given me. And his number one suspect was this missing man, I was sure. I decided I needed to find out more about them as I checked the kitchen for any evidence of using the back entrance to get out and climb down. Yet I couldn't seem to find any accelerant or a cause for the blaze itself. It was as though it had simply appeared out of nowhere. I knew not to prejudge the entire situation, but something wasn't adding up, and I felt like I was being lied to. I can think of many reasons why that would be, most of them involving money. I took pictures of the burnt office one more time and prepared to leave, resolving to get the truth from Paul that night. Another thing that was off was the entire vibe of the Firewatch. I've always felt that when I visit the aftermath of an incident like this, they're devoid of life. Yet as I left the empty building, I had this eerie feeling someone was watching me. There's a force that doesn't want us here, Paul had said. I had no idea if he was being serious or was just another part of this strange case. There were too many questions. I stopped midway down the tower to take a smoke and look out at the tree line. The sun was down now, and all I could make out were the dark outlines of the firs and cedars. Forest stretches out like an ocean here, and you can watch the wind ripple across the tops of the trees like gentle waves. But what I saw that night wasn't the wind. I was thinking about just forgetting this whole thing, signing the paper and calling it a night when I saw something move in the trees. Then I realized it was actually a tree itself. One of the dark cedars seemed to gently walk across the horizon as though it had legs. I fumbled and tried to make sure I wasn't seeing things. It was so dark I thought my eyes had been playing tricks, so I ran up toward the tower to use the spotlight and get a better look. I angled it the best I could, trying to get a good idea on where the strange tree had disappeared to, and then turned it on. A long stream of light pierced the night. What I saw, I'm not sure I truly believe or understand. The tree looked like it had a face. Sharp bark contoured and open in a hollow hole that formed a mouth with sharp edges of broken branches that were meant as teeth. Its body was as wide as a house. Its legs were taller than a giraffe. They seemed to spread out and cover the ground, twisting and snagging the soil as it moved toward the Firewatch. I heard a low bellowing noise, like a grenade going off, and then a sharp, piercing shriek. Immediately, I shut the spotlight off and I ran. I pushed down the stairs and toward the trail, running for Paul's trailer. As I got inside and slammed the door, his face was a look of confusion and amusement. "Don't tell me you didn't hear that," I asked. He switched off his TV and shrugged. He told me eventually all the woods started sounding the same, and asked me what I saw. I took a moment to recompose myself and stood up straight. I told him it was nothing, I was just tired. He muttered that I looked worse than that and offered me some food as he grabbed his book. He was beginning to wonder what was taking me so long up there, that it was nearly morning. I found myself looking like a drunk girl at a frat house party, peeking through the blinds to make sure he was right. It only felt like 20 minutes at the most. Paul stood there for a moment, probably trying to decide if I'd lost my mind before turning to brew his coffee. He asked what it was like up there as he munched on his breakfast. I sat down, still unsettled by all that I'd seen and trying to make sense of it. I asked if he could tell me more about the volunteers. I took out my recorder to be sure I didn't miss any of the details. He seemed surprised I was now taking things so seriously, but went ahead and obliged the request, speaking directly into the microphone. He said they seemed like nice enough fellas, and that he never really bothered to get to know them. This time of year he's further south where they expect to see campers coming in for the holiday. And that no one ever really bothers with Sentinel Peak. It's almost forgotten entirely. "So you weren't here when the fire happened, I guessed?" He said he came to do a check on them. The volunteers are supposed to check in with the ranger's office on a semi-weekly basis, and they'd missed a couple times. It was a rookie mistake, but he wanted to be sure. When he got over the ridge, he saw the smoke rising and called it in. Vince said you thought it was arson, though. Why would you jump to that conclusion? I asked. He said he guessed he should have brought it up earlier, but our park been getting threats lately. I asked what kind of threats, like from a tree hugger or something? Paul laughed, but nodded as he sipped his coffee. He said Sentinel Peak is a relic and they want it torn down. Let the forest grow up and push us out. He said before the incident, he was really considering that, to let the ghosts have the place. Saying again that nature doesn't want us here anyway. I thought about what I'd seen only moments prior, and I asked him what he meant. If the Firewatch had had issues in the past. He admitted this wasn't the first time they'd lost some volunteers. He realized that Vince hadn't told me that. He said it was one of the main reasons we can't keep good folks. Everyone's scared they'll wind up disappearing. I asked him about the other incidents, and he said they weren't anything like this. But here and there, one of the volunteers would go missing from the Firewatch. Their partner usually had to finish it all up solo, though half of them pack up and leave. I mean, he said he would do it too if his only help disappeared. When you say vanish, it makes it sound like they don't just grab a flight and go home. Are you saying these people are never seen again? Why haven't they been reported? I asked. Paul looked at me like I was joking, and he sighed before explaining that people go missing in the woods all the time. They don't have the budget to search unless someone reports them. He said that these folks that disappeared, no one cared. I put down the recorder, recalling I'd only seen one corpse in the Firewatch. But something different happened this time, I commented as I looked out the window toward the burnt building. I told him I needed him to identify the body, and asked if he got a good look at the kids. He seemed surprised, but went along with it as he grabbed his coat and we walked toward the tower. My hope is once we realized which body was in the tower, it could help us begin a search for the survivor, to determine if it really was arson or something else entirely. As we stepped in, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Paul held his hand over his mouth as we closed the door, and I took a second look at the devastation. Everything had changed. Unlike before when I was looking at the front half of the building, now everything in the kitchen was torched and destroyed. The living room and bathroom seemed unfazed, and the body I'd encountered earlier was also missing. Instead, as we walked into the desiccated kitchen, I saw a different corpse covered in ash. This one was staring out the window, looking straight towards the trees that I'd seen moving only a few hours ago. It looked like they'd been preparing to bite down on an apple when the fire engulfed them. Paul admitted that he couldn't tell which one it was and apologized, as he tried not to gag. But my head was still spinning from the strange change in the room. There was no way I'd seen the same devastation earlier. I pulled my phone out and looked at the photographs, confirming I hadn't simply been seeing things. This isn't natural. It wasn't arson. It wasn't an accident either. In fact, I'm not sure what happened here, I told him. I let Paul look at the pictures I'd taken to judge his reaction. His face told me he was just as baffled as me, and frightened too. He told me he didn't think we should stay there. I disagreed. I told him something unnatural was going on here, and that's exactly why we needed to stay, and set my equipment down on the couch. I told him if we stayed, we could reveal what caused all this. He seemed uncomfortable, but couldn't give me an excuse to leave, so we both started gathering samples of the burnt materials from the kitchen to test. It could reveal a lot about the fire, I told him as I checked the time. It was strange. It felt as though no amount of time had passed since we arrived, yet I was exhausted. Was something affecting us mentally here as well? We kept gathering materials for another hour or so as I felt my energy drain more and more. Before I knew what was happening, I felt the need to collapse on the couch and rest. Paul was complaining that he was feeling nauseous. He said he thought it was the burnt bodies, and I asked how I could stomach any of this. I ignored him and closed my eyes, trying to relax as I let my mind unwind. Instead, it wasn't long before I felt that I was unraveling. Paul grabbed my shoulders and shook me awake, his eyes confused. He was yelling at me, asking me why I was asleep as he pointed out the window. He asked me if I could hear it. It was the booming noise again, the one that made my entire body tremble. I stood up, my knees wobbling as I heard the ground toward our tower start to crumble. "What is that?" I asked. Paul showed her that he couldn't see anything and that had been going on for 10 minutes. He thought that whatever it was going to tear us apart. I raced to the kitchen to get a better look, the glowing eyes of the strange monster in the trees making me want to run the other way. Instead, a swath of fire pushed itself into the tower, covering the counter next to me and making me leap back. The entire counter was covered in flames. Paul grabbed a fire extinguisher and doused a small inferno as the monster bellowed and the Firewatch shook. I yelled that we needed to get out of there as I ran away from the kitchen. Paul was standing there at the counter trying to protect what little was left. Instead, the flames covered his body the way ants attacked an invasive predator. It made it seem like the fire had a mind of its own. Immediately, I ran from the tower, not bothering to look back. I could hear the gigantic noises from above, and I was sure that if I hesitated for even a moment, the entire Firewatch would fall down on top of me. I didn't stop running until I made it to Paul's trailer. I found the radio and called Vince's station. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Sentinel Peak requesting assistance." There was only static as I heard the creature moving about outside, trying to find me. I could hear the crackling of fire. Was it really going to burn down the whole forest just to exterminate me? I hunched down and waited for the woods to become silent again. Then I heard Vince on the radio. "Sentinel Peak, do you copy?" I grabbed the receiver and shouted, "There's a fire! Send help right away! All the Rangers need evacuation immediately!" The radio filled with static again and then died. Then I heard a knock at the door. Instinctively, I grabbed the nearest object to use as a weapon, a letter opener, and stood by the door to let the stranger in. To my shock and confusion, it was Paul. "You're alive? How's that possible? I saw you burning up." He didn't even show signs of scars on his body. He looked just as confused as me. "Who the fuck are you?" he spat back. Is this some kind of joke? It's Nathan. I came here to inspect the fire." I kept my distance from him, wondering if he was even the same person I'd met the day before. Had the fire done something to him? Recreated him somehow? Paul mumbled something into his walkie-talkie and then answered, "What fire?" We walked out of his trailer and I looked up at Sentinel Peak. It appeared untouched by any blaze at all. "What in the world?" I said as I started to run toward the stairs. There were no signs of ash or burns or anything that I'd seen before. I heard Paul shouting to me as I raced to the top. I needed to see the inside of the Firewatch. I needed to understand what was happening. As I stepped into the tower, I found myself looking at a brand new office. Polished furniture, a full pantry. It looked like nothing had been used. Paul stormed in behind me, demanding that I explain to him what was going on. I tried to tell him that there was a fire here, that he died, and maybe I died too? It was making me nauseous. I was seeing flashes of this other Firewatch where Paul was devoured by the inferno and I was the one trapped in the bathroom. We were the ones who came here. We're trapped inside a nightmare of our design. That creature, it made us a part of the forest. Paul was reaching for his gun, clearly disturbed by everything I'd said. He warned that I had to leave. I tried to make him listen. I tried to tell him we had to stop it before it happened again. But instead of listening, he fired a shot straight toward me. I ducked down and the bullet hit the propane tank right behind me. The explosion forced me toward Paul. A burst of fire consuming the front of the station. The entire Firewatch was covered in an inferno within mere moments. I found myself trying to grab a hold of the splintering wood as the tower crumbled. I was being swallowed up by the devastation, seeping into the very ground. I lost consciousness at some point, hardly able to move from the blast. The Firewatch was gone, but something else now was rumbling toward me. It was the giant. I tried to move and to run, but instead I realized my body was trapped by the rubble of the collapsing tower. The monster was reaching down, its massive branches digging up the debris and picking me up as a rag doll. Vines encircled my legs to prevent me from being able to escape as I was swung up towards the giant's neck. Its glowing eyes were looking into my soul, and it opened its sharp, bark mouth to spread fire over my body. My skin was burning. I felt paralyzed, and I was becoming a part of this massive tree creature. As it happened, I saw forest being scorched in front of my eyes. I was taken on an astral journey through the body of this creature. I saw its kind, helplessly watching as man came and tore down the forest, fighting back and taking all they could. Sentinel Peak was one of the few places these creatures still called home, and then the forest rangers built the station. I saw how the tree had to watch on the sidelines as its own brothers and sisters were destroyed. I felt its pain every time they attacked the forest. It happened not once or even a dozen times, but thousands of times. And yet the creature could do nothing. By some miracle, maybe magic or the sacred power of the land itself, the tree found the will to walk and to attack. The Firewatch needed to be taken down, for these people had no purpose here. I recall Paul's words about how useless it was, and now I could see why. These people were wasting resources that belonged to the forest. This was a fight that humanity would lose. I watched as the tree monster used its newfound strength to burn the tower down, the fragments of the earth sorting into different pieces. Each part of the scattered memories were the earth itself, broken and disjointed more than any mere words could convey. It was trying to put itself back together and frozen in time itself, and we were causing it more and more suffering. The giant said nothing, letting me experience all these painful things as I was transported to the edge of the valley, watching as the destruction of the Firewatch put itself back together again. Then the tree was silent and frozen, as if never a monster at all, and I was as human as I'd always been. I stood there for a moment, looking towards Sentinel Peak and trying to make sense of the strange otherworldly experience I'd had. I'd been given the gift of seeing the world through the eyes of nature, understanding its pain. I saw Paul walking toward me, waving his arms and looking like a fool. Another typical human destroying this blessed land. "You must be the new recruit. Come on up, the place is waiting for you," he said. He guided me and told me all about the Firewatch and its long history, but I wasn't listening. I was looking at the place and how easy it would be to torch it. I waited for him to leave and thanked him, checking my phone and deleting the old photos. The past was removed. Nature healed itself the way it always does, and now I can play a part and make sure it's completely cured. I doused the Firewatch in gasoline, and then I looked toward the forest horizon as I set a match and let the fire begin to burn. I am part of the desolation now. I am the ash that smolders and lingers and returns to the earth. This place will be forgotten. It will return to what it once was. But we of the forest, we will continue to remain, forever a memory of this suffering we can endure